Some men confuse loud noises with real power, right until they wake a sleeping monster. You might look at my scars and think my silence means submission. It does not. It is simply how someone who has walked through hell locks away the instinct to burn the room to the ground. Listen closely. The price of arrogance is not always paid in blood. Sometimes it is paid with the absolute annihilation of the ego. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Everly Graham. It was late August in the sprawling suburbs of Austin, Texas, and the afternoon heat did not just sit on your skin. It pressed down on your chest like a physical, suffocating weight. The air was incredibly thick, vibrating with the endless, deafening drone of cicadas hidden in the oak trees. Every breath tasted heavy, saturated with the pungent scent of hickory smoke billowing from a massive, custom-built grill and the bitter tang of overhopped craft beer that the men around me were drinking by the gallon. I sat alone on a low wooden bench in the furthest, most shadowed corner of the patio, doing my absolute best to remain completely invisible. I am 38 years old, though on days like today, my body feels at least 2 decades older. A thick, raised, and jagged scar runs the entire length of my left collarbone, diving down beneath the collar of my shirt. It is a permanent physical reminder of a life I no longer discuss with anyone. As I sat there holding a glass of lukewarm water, I subtly shifted my weight to the right, clenching my jaw as I tried to ease the familiar burning spike of sciatica shooting down my left leg. It was a lingering souvenir from a devastating impact over 10 years ago, a daily agony I learned to mask with a blank face. A few yards away, my younger sister's husband, Derek, was happily holding court. Derek is the quintessential modern tech bro who recently pivoted his career to become the founder and chief executive officer of a startup manufacturing tactical protective gear. He loves to dress the part. Today he wore expensive cargo pants with far too many useless pockets and a tight black moisture-wicking shirt designed to show off his meticulously sculpted gym muscles. He wore a heavy military-style digital watch that cost thousands of dollars. Yet Derek had never served a single day in the armed forces. He had never marched with a heavy pack, never slept in the dirt, and certainly never had someone shoot at him. However, he spoke to his peers with the loud, unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed that playing weekend paintball and reading military history forums gave him the equivalent of actual combat experience. Derek was currently flipping a massive slab of beef brisket, surrounded by a small, captive audience of his new business investors and corporate sycophants. He loved having an audience. He thrived on it. As was his usual pattern, he needed to inflate his own fragile ego by shrinking someone else's. Unfortunately today, his chosen target was me and my supposedly boring desk job as a mid-level logistics analyst at Meridian Strattech. He laughed loudly at his own jokes, a booming, hollow sound that grated harshly against my exhausted nerves. He turned toward my shadowed corner, casually pointing his heavy, grease-stained metal barbecue tongs directly at my face. The disrespect was deliberate and palpable. He wanted to assert dominance in front of his wealthy new friends. "Hey, Everly," Derek called out, his voice cutting through the hum of the yard and making sure every single person stopped their conversations to look at me. "Seeing as you always insist on wearing that old olive drab military jacket everywhere you go, I have to ask you honestly, can you even shoot?" He grinned, looking around at his friends, fully expecting me to flush bright red, to look down at my shoes, or to stutter out some weak, defensive excuse. He desperately wanted the important men around him to chuckle at the plain, quiet, broken woman sitting alone in the corner. But I did not feel a single spark of anger. Anger requires a massive amount of energy, and Derek was simply not worth a fraction of mine. I looked right through him, my expression remaining completely flat and unbothered. When I finally spoke, my voice was incredibly dry and exhausted, but it carried a precise, chilling edge that cut through the sticky Texas heat like a blade made of dry ice. "I am Nightfall Actual," I said. Derek opened his mouth, ready to let out another booming laugh, preparing to dismiss whatever he assumed was an absurd joke. But before a single sound could leave his throat, the sharp, violent crash of shattering glass sliced through the suffocating atmosphere of the backyard. Over by the stone fire pit, Marcus Vance had dropped his heavy pint glass onto the concrete patio. Marcus was Derek's newest, wealthiest, and most important business partner. He was a mountain of a man, possessing razor-sharp eyes and the unmistakable coiled spring posture of a former Navy SEAL. Marcus stood entirely frozen. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving his deeply tanned skin looking sickly and pale. He stared at me as if he had just seen a ghost walk directly out of a burning building. Slowly, deliberately, he moved forward. He pushed past the other investors, completely and utterly ignoring Derek's very existence. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of my bench. This massive, hardened warrior snapped his heels together and bowed his upper body forward at a rigid, perfect angle of respect. When he finally spoke, his deep voice was not loud, but it trembled heavily with an emotion so raw and painful that it made the very air around us feel electrified. "Thank you for not leaving us behind in the Helman Valley," he said. The music from the outdoor speakers suddenly seemed miles away. The entire backyard fell into a dead, absolute, and suffocating silence. Derek could not let it go. Humiliation is a toxic poison to a man who builds his entire identity on the fragile foundation of other people's opinions. Instead of taking the hint and backing down, his bruised ego mutated into a pathetic, obsessive resentment. He immediately took his grievance to the digital world. Over the next 48 hours, he bombarded his social media channels, desperately trying to salvage his tough guy image in front of his thousands of tactical gear-obsessed followers. He posted lengthy, condescending videos, claiming that the entire situation was a massive misunderstanding. He sat in his pristine, air-conditioned garage, surrounded by unused survival gear, and reduced my military service to nothing more than being a glorified delivery driver in the sky. He typed out long, rambling paragraphs insisting that I just flew cargo planes out of perfectly safe zones and that his new business partner had simply suffered from heat stroke and mistaken me for someone else. He laughed it off on live streams, calling me his quirky, dramatic sister-in-law who liked to play pretend. To Derek, the military was an aesthetic. It was a lifestyle brand to be optimized, filtered, and monetized on the internet. He did not know that real war is not fought in comment sections or measured in digital engagement. I tried to ignore the digital circus. I let him type his little fables while I fought my own private wars in the dead of night. When the sun goes down and the suburban neighborhood falls completely silent, the ghosts always come back. My reality was not a heavily edited video playing on a bright screen. It was waking up at 3 a.m, my bed sheets completely soaked in a cold, terrible sweat. It was the phantom, deafening chop-chop-chop of helicopter rotor blades slicing through the thin mountain air, a sound that lived permanently inside my skull. It was the sharp, terrifying rattle of anti-aircraft fire echoing in my ears and the heavy, metallic scent of copper that you can never quite wash out of your nose, no matter how hard you scrub. On those long nights, I would drag my aching body to the bathroom sink, dry swallow 2 heavy-duty prescription painkillers, and stare at the exhausted, hollow-eyed woman in the mirror. I kept my mouth shut and buried my past for one single, unwavering reason. That reason was my younger sister. Chloe believed she had a perfect, happy marriage. She loved her suburban house, her garden, and her carefully curated life. I absorbed Derek's constant insults and swallowed the trauma so she could keep taking her smiling family holiday photos in absolute peace. I was the designated shield, taking the emotional shrapnel so she would not have to feel the destructive blast. But a shield can only take so many heavy hits before the metal begins to splinter and crack. The fatal fracture happened exactly 1 week later, on a perfectly mundane Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my sterile, gray desk at Meridian StratTech, blankly reviewing complex supply chain spreadsheets, when a heavy shadow fell over my computer monitor. I looked up to see Marcus Vance standing in the doorway of my cubicle. He looked entirely out of place under the harsh, soul-sucking fluorescent lights of a corporate office environment. He was wearing a dark, tailored suit, his face completely grim and devoid of the polite, artificial warmth people usually wear in business settings. He did not offer a friendly greeting. He did not ask how my day was going. He simply stepped inside, securely closed the thin glass door behind him to block out the noise of the typing pool, and dropped a massive, heavily bound stack of thick documents onto the exact center of my desk. The heavy thud made my coffee cup rattle. I pulled some strings and got a secure copy of the final vendor submissions for the state of Texas, Marcus said, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that commanded absolute, immediate attention. Derek's company is aggressively bidding for a massive statewide law enforcement and security training contract. The budget allocation from the government is staggering. We are talking about millions of dollars. I frowned deeply, looking from Marcus's dead serious expression down to the thick stack of paper. His company sells cheap tactical vests made of low-grade polymer manufactured overseas. He has absolutely zero infrastructure, personnel, or experience to conduct state-level security training. I know, Marcus replied, his jaw clenching so tight that the muscle in his cheek twitched violently. Open the folder. Go directly to page 47. I reached out and flipped open the heavy black binder, my fingers sliding over the thick, glossy pages of the executive summary. When I finally reached the specific section detailing the company's executive management team and operational qualifications, my breath suddenly hitched, trapping the stale office air violently in my lungs. Staring back at me, printed in bold black ink directly beneath the gaudy, aggressive logo of Derek's company, was my own name. Everly Graham. But it was not just my name sitting there. It was my entire classified military service record, heavily redacted but unmistakably, undeniably mine. He had formally listed my official corporate title as Senior Tactical Advisor and Lead Combat Consultant. I turned the page with fingers that had suddenly begun to tremble uncontrollably. There, resting at the very bottom of a legally binding state contractor agreement, was my handwritten signature. It was a clumsy, desperate forgery, looking like a child trying to trace an adult's handwriting, but it was officially there on the dotted line. My mind raced at lightning speed, slamming terrible pieces of a puzzle together. There was only one single physical location in the entire world where those specific service dates, unit designations, and commendation records existed. They were locked inside a solid cedar memory box that I kept hidden under old winter coats in the deepest, darkest corner of Chloe's attic. Derek had not just insulted me to his friends. He had physically invaded my private property, broken the brass lock on my chest, and stolen the absolute darkest, most painful chapters of my existence. But the physical theft of my paper documents was not even the most repulsive part of the proposal. The worst part was the visual presentation he had constructed. Flipping rapidly to the final appendix of the proposal, I found a series of high-resolution photographs. They were not professional, studio-lit headshots. They were candid, secret pictures taken from a distance at family Thanksgiving dinners and sunny backyard birthday parties. Pictures of me sitting alone, staring off into the distance, looking profoundly tired, broken, and isolated from the rest of the happy family. Derek had taken these deeply vulnerable private moments, slapped his tactical company's ugly watermarks directly over my face, and typed up an entirely fabricated, sickening narrative beneath them. He had pitched a disgusting, tear-jerking story to the State Evaluation Board, painting himself as a benevolent, generous corporate savior who had graciously taken in a deeply damaged, mentally struggling war veteran. He was actively using my pain, my physical scars, and my silent, agonizing suffering as a cheap marketing gimmick to secure millions of dollars in taxpayer funding. He was literally monetizing my worst nightmares. I slowly closed the heavy folder, my hands pressing flat against the smooth leather cover. The cheap fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz infinitely louder, matching the sudden, violent ringing that erupted in my ears. The cold, suffocating grip of a familiar panic attack threatened to rise in my chest, but it was instantly, completely incinerated by a sudden, blinding flash of pure, unadulterated rage. The silence was over. I did not storm into his office. I did not scream or throw a fit. Screaming is a catastrophic loss of control, and absolute control was the only weapon I had left. I calmly drove back to my own apartment, locked the front door, and went straight to work. I spent the next 72 hours treating Derek like a hostile target in a tactical reconnaissance operation. I utilized every single forensic accounting trick I had mastered as a logistics analyst and quietly called in favors from old contacts scattered across the financial sector. What I unearthed was an absolute financial bloodbath. His highly publicized tactical gear startup was not just struggling. It was a decaying corpse artificially propped up by predatory high-interest loans and fabricated revenue projections. He was completely and fatally leveraged. He owed well over $800,000 to 3 different, highly aggressive private equity firms. His physical inventory was rotting in a rented warehouse, completely unsold, while his monthly overhead costs were burning through his remaining cash at an astonishing rate. However, the most chilling discovery was hidden deep within a secondary encrypted ledger. He had not merely gambled his own money away. He had quietly and systematically manipulated my younger sister into signing her own name as the primary financial guarantor on a massive collateralized business loan. If his company defaulted, the bank possessed the immediate legal authority to seize the 4-bedroom house that Chloe cherished so deeply. That lucrative state-funded security training contract was not an aggressive business expansion. It was his absolute last, desperate gasp for oxygen. I sent him a single, sterile text message demanding a meeting at an old, run-down diner situated on the desolate edge of the interstate. It was an ugly, forgotten place bathed in flickering neon lights, serving burnt coffee at 2 o'clock in the morning. He walked through the glass doors exactly 20 minutes late, wearing a smug, highly practiced smile. He clearly thought this was just another trivial family dispute he could easily manage with his usual arrogant charm. He slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, not even bothering to glance at the laminated menu. I did not waste a single breath on pleasantries. I slid a thin, unmarked manila envelope across the sticky surface of the table. You have exactly 24 hours to formally withdraw your bid from the State Evaluation Board, I stated, my voice completely stripped of any human warmth or emotion. You will permanently remove my name, my classified service record, and my forged signature from your fraudulent documents. If you fail to do this, I will personally hand this comprehensive financial dossier to the federal authorities. Derek casually picked up the envelope and pulled out the pages. He glanced at the detailed printouts of his crippling debt summaries and the undeniable proof of his forgery. I expected him to panic. I expected him to sweat, to beg for mercy, or to angrily deny the accusations. Instead, his arrogant smile only grew wider, twisting into a genuinely malicious, calculating grin. He leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on the table, and looked at me with the cold, dead eyes of a cornered rat that had just realized it held the ultimate trump card. "Are you really going to do that, Everly?" he asked, his voice dripping with thick, suffocating condescension. "Are you actually going to play the righteous, tragic hero and burn my entire life to the ground? Because if you blow the whistle on this state contract, my company goes into immediate, irreversible liquidation. I will be forced to declare bankruptcy by Friday morning. And do you know exactly what happens next? The bank takes the house. They will legally evict your sweet, innocent sister and her children, throwing them directly out onto the street. You will be the one who single-handedly ruined her perfect little life, not me. He picked up an empty sugar packet, entirely too pleased with his own sociopathic leverage. It is just a few dusty old titles, Derek sneered, tossing the incriminating paperwork back onto the table with a flick of his wrist. You do not lose a single thing by letting me use your little war stories. But if I win this contract, I save this entire family from total financial ruin. Do not be a selfish buzzkill. For once in your miserable life, just be a team player. He abruptly stood up, tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the table, and walked out into the freezing parking lot, walking with the swagger of a man who was absolutely convinced he had won the war. I sat completely alone in the silent booth for a very long time. The glaring neon light humming overhead felt as if reality was finally locking into sharp, excruciating clarity. I rose slowly, made my way out to my weathered truck, and slumped heavily into the driver's seat. I squeezed the heavy leather steering wheel with such force that my knuckles blanched bone white. My fingernails dug so fiercely into my palms that they left deep, painful crescents pressed into the skin. For more than a decade, I had held on to the absolute conviction that staying silent was the greatest price to pay. I thought that by quietly absorbing the insults, aggressively hiding my physical scars, and letting parasitic men like Derek step all over me, I was actively protecting the people I loved. I was trying to buy peace with my own constant submission. But sitting there in the freezing dark cab of my truck, I realized a fundamental, terrifying truth about human nature. Concession does not buy peace. Weakness does not buy harmony. Giving in to a predator does not satisfy them. It only teaches them exactly how to successfully extort you. My endless, exhausting patience had not protected my sister at all. It had simply handed a pathetic, desperate man the perfect financial hostage. I wiped the fresh blood from my palms onto the denim of my jeans. The heavy protective shield of passivity I had carried for a decade was completely shattered. Beneath the ruins of that shield, the hardened, lethal instincts of a highly trained operative were fully awake and breathing cold, sharp air. The time for quietly taking the hit and turning the other cheek was officially over. The decision was absolute. I was going to destroy him. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the absolute darkness of my living room, the glowing screen of my heavily encrypted laptop illuminating the bare walls. During my years of active service, I had pulled a significant number of operators out of burning valleys, shattered city streets, and compromised extraction points. Many of those men and women were now deeply embedded within the civilian infrastructure of the state. They worked as senior forensic accountants, lead investigators for the state auditor, and federal compliance officers. I did not call them to ask for casual favors. I called in blood debts. Over the course of 12 consecutive hours, I systematically weaponized my past. I made 6 separate phone calls. Each conversation was entirely brief, completely devoid of small talk, and ruthlessly efficient. I provided them with Derek's corporate tax identification numbers, the routing paths of his hidden shell companies, and the specific numeric codes for the state contract he was desperately targeting. By 6 o'clock the following evening, an airtight, legally devastating dossier was quietly making its way directly up the chain of command within the Federal Oversight Division. The culmination of this operation was set to take place at the Global Security Technology Expo, held at the massive downtown Austin Convention Center. This was the exact location where Derek was scheduled to deliver his final, desperate funding pitch directly to the State Evaluation Board. He needed to close the deal in front of hundreds of potential investors and government officials to secure his millions. A thick, glossy VIP admission pass arrived in my mailbox via a priority courier. Marcus had arranged the delivery. The lanyard felt heavy in my hands, functioning as a physical countdown clock ticking methodically toward absolute zero. The final catalyst came later that same evening. My cell phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter. It was my younger sister. When I answered, I did not hear the usual cheerful, high-pitched tone she forced for the holidays. I heard the quiet, suffocated sobbing of a woman completely broken by her own husband. Chloe wept uncontrollably into the receiver, her voice trembling with absolute terror. Derek had spent the entire afternoon pacing the house, screaming at her, throwing heavy objects against the living room wall, and violently blaming everyone else for his impending financial ruin. "Please," Chloe begged, her voice cracking painfully over the line. "Just let him do what he wants this one time, to keep things smooth. Let him have his way so the screaming finally stops. I cannot take it anymore." I closed my eyes tightly, listening to the agonizing sound of a hostage pleading for her captor. Her desperate submission was the absolute final drop of water that caused the glass to overflow. It hardened the last remaining fragment of my familial empathy into solid, unbreakable concrete. I promised her, in a very calm and steady voice, that everything would be completely fine by tomorrow afternoon. I hung up the phone and placed it gently on the counter. You do not negotiate with a parasite. If you truly want to save the garden, you cannot just trim the rotten leaves. You must rip the weed entirely out of the earth by its absolute deepest roots. Just before midnight, Marcus arrived at my apartment. He did not knock loudly. He tapped twice on the window glass. He stood in the doorway holding a single, unsealed manila folder. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts solemn respect and dangerous anticipation. He handed me the official roster of the State Evaluation Board, presiding over the expo the next morning. "Look at the chairman," Marcus said softly. I scanned the list of state politicians and corporate executives until my eyes locked onto the name printed at the very top. Colonel Thomas Vance. He was not just Marcus's father. He was the senior commanding officer who had personally overseen the disastrous, bloody extraction operation I had flown into all those years ago. He was the man who had authorized my deployment when every other pilot categorically refused to fly into the storm. He knew exactly what my call sign meant. He knew the absolute, unfiltered truth of my service. The trap was now perfectly set. The only remaining task was to dress appropriately for the execution. I walked into my quiet bedroom and pulled a long, heavy plastic garment bag from the very back of my closet. I unzipped it slowly. The familiar scent of old starch and polished brass instantly filled the room, transporting my mind backward in time. It was my formal military dress uniform. I spent the next 2 hours standing perfectly still over a metal ironing board. I pressed the dark blue fabric with meticulous, obsessive precision. The loud hiss of the hot steam rising from the iron sounded exactly like a snake preparing to strike. I pressed the trousers until the creases were sharp enough to cut through solid glass. I sat on the edge of the bed and meticulously polished the black leather dress shoes with a soft cloth until they flawlessly reflected the dim yellow glow of the bedroom lamp. Finally, I reached into the bottom drawer of my heavy wooden desk and pulled out a small, faded velvet box. I opened the lid. Resting inside on a bed of white silk was the Distinguished Flying Cross. It was a heavy medal of pure bronze, awarded specifically for extraordinary heroism in aerial flight. I had never shown it to my family. I had never worn it in public. Tonight, my hands did not shake at all. I picked up the heavy brass pin and drove it firmly through the thick fabric, securing it perfectly over my heart. I stood before the full-length mirror, looking at the cold, calculating reflections staring back at me. I was no longer a tired logistics analyst hiding in the shadows. The sniper was in position, the scope was dialed in, and the target was walking completely blind into the kill zone. The Grand Exposition Hall of the Austin Convention Center was a cavernous, intimidating space constructed of polished steel, high-definition LED screens, and massive glass windows. Over 500 influential people sat in the velvet chairs facing the main stage. There were state senators, wealthy private equity investors, high-ranking police officials, and the entire state evaluation board. The air conditioning pumped a freezing current through the room, but the atmosphere was electric with the promise of millions of dollars in government funding. At the absolute center of the brilliantly illuminated stage stood Derek. He was pacing back and forth with a wireless microphone clipped to his expensive, dark, tailored suit. Behind him, a massive 50-foot digital screen displayed his company logo. He was currently in the middle of delivering the most important, high-stakes pitch of his entire fraudulent life. He spoke with a booming artificial gravitas, desperately attempting to sound like a hardened combat veteran addressing his troops. "When we talk about security, we are not just talking about equipment," Derek proclaimed, pausing for dramatic effect while gesturing broadly to the captivated audience. "We are talking about sacrifice. We are talking about the agonizing, unspoken realities of the battlefield. The blood, the sweat, and the absolute brotherhood forged in the darkest corners of the world." He pressed a small remote control in his hand. The massive screen behind him shifted. It displayed a heavily blurred, blown-up image of my classified military dossier. The dark black lines of the redactions looked like deep scars across the white paper. Next to it was one of those stolen, candid photographs of me sitting quietly at a family barbecue, looking exhausted and distant. "My company does not just hire consultants," Derek continued, lowering his voice into a fake, sympathetic whisper. "We rescue heroes. The woman you see on this screen is our lead combat consultant. She was struggling, lost in the civilian world, fighting the terrible demons of post-traumatic stress. But we brought her into our family. We gave her a purpose. We took her shattered battlefield experience and refined it into the ultimate tactical training program for our state law enforcement. Because true leadership means taking care of those who sacrificed everything for our freedom." The crowd was completely silent, utterly absorbed in the manipulative, disgusting fiction he was spinning. Several investors in the front row actually nodded in solemn approval. He was winning. He was minutes away from securing a massive fortune built entirely on my stolen pain. Then, I kicked the heavy wooden double doors at the absolute rear of the exposition hall. The doors flew open with a violent, echoing crash that sounded exactly like a gunshot inside the cavernous room. Every single head in the massive audience instantly whipped around. The technician running the main lighting board panicked and accidentally hit a switch. A blinding, pure white tracking spotlight instantly snapped away from the stage and dropped directly onto my position at the back of the center aisle. I stepped forward into the blistering light. I was not wearing my faded jeans or my old olive drab jacket. I was wearing my formal, dark blue military dress uniform. The fabric was flawlessly pressed. The gold buttons gleamed like fire. And the perfectly polished black leather of my dress shoes struck the hardwood floor with a sharp, rhythmic, and terrifyingly precise click, click, click. My chest was decorated with the heavy, undeniable weight of my service. 3 rows of beautifully colored campaign ribbons rested perfectly aligned, but they were entirely overshadowed by the heavy, solid bronze of the Distinguished Flying Cross, pinned securely over my heart. The metal caught the harsh glare of the spotlight, flashing like a warning beacon across the dark auditorium. The heavy, rhythmic sound of my footsteps was the only noise in the entire building. The silence from the crowd was no longer one of respect. It was a sudden, paralyzing shock. I marched straight down the center aisle, my eyes locked permanently on the man standing on the stage. Derek froze completely. All the artificial color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking like wet gray ash. His mouth hung open. The wireless microphone in his hand began to tremble violently. As I reached the front row, he desperately tried to salvage his crumbling narrative. He swallowed hard, forcing a panicked, sickly smile onto his face. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek stammered, his voice cracking and pitching upward in sheer terror. What an unexpected honor. Please, allow me to introduce my sister-in-law, our senior tactical advisor. He did not get to finish his sentence. In the exact center of the front row, sitting behind a long wooden table marked for the State Evaluation Board, an older, broad-shouldered man pushed his chair back with a loud screech. Colonel Thomas Vance stood up to his full, towering height. He wore a sharply tailored civilian suit, but the way he held his spine belonged entirely to the military. He completely ignored Derek. He kept his steely, intense gaze locked exclusively on me. He recognized my face. He recognized the specific arrangement of ribbons, and he intimately knew the blood and fire required to earn the heavy bronze cross shining on my chest. Without speaking a single word, the colonel snapped his heels together. The sound echoed through the silent hall. He raised his right hand in a sharp, crisp, flawless military salute, holding it perfectly still, paying absolute respect to the pilot who had flown directly into the teeth of an ambush to drag his men out of the dirt. A collective physical gasp rippled through the hundreds of people in the audience. If the chairman of the evaluation board was saluting this woman, the dynamic in the room had instantly and catastrophically shifted. I did not return the salute immediately. I maintained my march, ascending the short flight of carpeted stairs up to the main stage. I walked directly up to Derek. Up close, I could smell the sharp, sour stench of absolute panic radiating from his skin. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His eyes darted wildly, searching for any possible exit. I reached out and smoothly ripped the microphone directly out of his trembling hand. With my other hand, I snatched the presentation clicker from his frozen fingers. I turned to face the massive audience. The blinding stage lights washed over my uniform, but my vision was perfectly clear. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice in anger. I spoke with the cold, measured, and absolute precision of a predator executing a fatal strike. "My name is Everly Graham," I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the massive speaker system. My official operational call sign was Nightfall Actual. I served 4 tours of combat duty as a search and rescue pilot. I am not a consultant for this company. I have never been an employee of this company. And I am certainly not a broken, helpless charity case requiring rescue by a man who has never spent a single second of his life in a combat zone. I pressed a button on the clicker. The massive 50-foot screen behind me instantly shifted. Derek's carefully curated marketing slides vanished. In their place appeared high-resolution, undeniable images of the forensic financial dossier I had compiled. The screen was filled with bright red bank ledgers, aggressive debt collection notices, and the damning structural charts of his various shell companies. "The man standing behind me is not a tactical expert," I continued smoothly, gesturing to the staggering financial ruins displayed on the screen. "He is a desperate, failing fraud who is currently over $800,000 in debt to predatory private equity firms. His entire corporate infrastructure is a hollow shell designed exclusively to funnel taxpayer money into his failing personal accounts." Derek let out a pathetic, suffocated wheeze, taking a clumsy step backward. The investors in the front row began shifting angrily in their seats. Cell phones were suddenly whipping out, recording every single second of the slaughter. I pressed the clicker again. The screen shifted to a massive, perfectly clear image of the final page of his government proposal. It highlighted my stolen service record and, most importantly, the clumsy, forged signature at the bottom of the page. Next to it, I displayed a certified handwriting analysis comparing the forgery to my actual, legal signature. In order to meet the minimum tactical requirements for this state contract, he illegally broke into my private property, I announced, the absolute freezing calm of my voice cutting through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "He physically stole my classified federal service records. He digitally altered private family photographs to manipulate your emotions. And he committed blatant, undeniable forgery on a legally binding state government document." The auditorium was completely erupting now. State senators were angrily whispering to their aides. The chief of police leaned over, speaking furiously into his phone. Colonel Vance remained standing, his arms now crossed tightly over his chest, his eyes burning with absolute righteous fury as he stared at Derek. Derek was completely falling apart. He raised his hands defensively, shaking his head. "No," he whispered into the empty air, though no microphone amplified his pathetic voice. "No, this is a misunderstanding. She is crazy. She is unwell." I turned slightly, looking directly into his terrified, wide eyes. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was mere inches from his face, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable of the final lethal blow. "You asked me at a barbecue if I even knew how to shoot," I said softly, yet the words echoed like a bomb going off in the hall. "I am going to show you exactly how accurate my aim really is." I turned back to the audience, delivering the absolute final strike. Submitting fraudulent claims of military heroism and service to secure financial gain, specifically government contracts, is a direct, severe violation of the Federal Stolen Valor Act, I declared, my voice ringing with total, unshakable authority. It is a federal crime punishable by severe fines and immediate imprisonment. This morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, a fully authenticated, unredacted copy of this exact dossier was physically handed to the lead investigative field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in Austin. As of this exact moment, this is no longer a corporate pitch. It is an active, open federal crime scene. The words Federal Bureau of Investigation hit the room like a physical shockwave. Investors frantically jumped out of their seats, desperate to immediately distance themselves from the radioactive disaster on the stage. The members of the State Evaluation Board were angrily packing up their briefcases, thoroughly disgusted and deeply humiliated by the attempted deception. I slowly turned my head to look at Derek. He had stopped moving entirely. His carefully constructed reality had been utterly, completely annihilated in less than 5 minutes. His knees finally buckled under the immense, crushing weight of the truth. He collapsed onto the hard stage floor, falling awkwardly onto his hands and knees. His expensive suit wrinkled and bunched around his shoulders. He stared blankly at the polished wood beneath him, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocating fish. He could not form a single word. He could not defend himself. He was absolutely, entirely destroyed. I did not offer him a hand. I did not offer him a single ounce of pity. I simply turned my back on the ruin of a pathetic man, walked calmly down the stage steps, and strode out of the chaotic, screaming auditorium. I left him completely alone in the blinding spotlight with the catastrophic, inescapable consequences of his own arrogance. The fallout was as swift as it was completely devastating. Derek's artificial corporate empire evaporated overnight. By the following morning, federal agents had officially raided his warehouse, seizing computers, files, and every piece of counterfeit tactical gear he had ever imported. His company was immediately dissolved. The private equity firms he owed money to descended like vultures, aggressively stripping him of his personal assets, his luxury vehicles, and his carefully curated public image. The same wealthy investors and tactical enthusiasts who had eagerly applauded him just 24 hours earlier now aggressively distanced themselves, treating him like a highly contagious disease. He was entirely blacklisted from the industry, facing massive, crippling financial penalties and the very real, impending threat of federal incarceration. But his financial ruin was never my primary objective. 3 days before I walked onto that stage, I had quietly initiated a massive transfer of funds. I emptied nearly every single cent of my personal retirement savings, a fund I had meticulously built over 15 long years. I used that money to anonymously purchase the collateralized debt tied directly to my sister's mortgage. I legally removed the bank's leverage and transferred the deed free and clear into Chloe's name alone. When Derek finally dragged himself home after the convention, a broken, terrified shell of a man expecting to use her as his final emotional punching bag. He found the house completely empty. Chloe had packed her bags, taken the children, and left a signed divorce petition sitting neatly on the kitchen counter. For the very first time in her adult life, she was completely unequivocally free from his suffocating grip. Many people believe that executing a perfect revenge brings a massive, overwhelming rush of joy. They expect a triumphant celebration. But as I sat alone in my living room watching the dust settle, I did not feel arrogant, and I certainly did not feel happy. Instead, I felt a strange, echoing emptiness in my chest. However, it was not the hollow, crushing ache of loss. It was the necessary, clean emptiness of a room that had finally been cleared of heavy, toxic debris. I had spent over a decade carrying the exhausting, crushing weight of someone else's fragile ego. Putting that burden down did not make me jump for joy. It simply allowed me to stand up straight and breathe real oxygen for the very first time since I returned from overseas. A month later, I officially resigned from my soul-sucking corporate job. I packed up my few belongings and moved out of the congested city to a small, quiet wooden cabin sitting on 20 acres of untamed Texas grassland. It was there, on a particularly warm Tuesday evening, that an old, battered pickup truck rolled slowly down my gravel driveway. Marcus stepped out, wearing a faded t-shirt and work boots. He did not bring flowers or make any grand, dramatic speeches. He simply walked up the wooden steps of my front porch, carrying a cardboard six-pack of incredibly cheap domestic beer. I handed him an open bottle. We sat side by side on two old wooden rocking chairs, looking out over the vast, golden expanse of the open fields as the sun began to dip below the horizon. We sat there for a solid 2 hours, and neither of us spoke a single word about the Helmand Valley. We did not discuss the deafening sound of rotor blades, the smell of burning fuel, or the terrible ghosts that lived in the dark. We did not have to. True understanding does not require loud, endless chatter. Sometimes, the most profound healing happens when two soldiers simply sit together in the absolute quiet of a hard-won peace. As the first stars began to pierce through the darkening sky, I took a slow, deep breath of the cool country air. For so many years, I genuinely believed that my silence was a noble shield. I thought that keeping my head down and swallowing the abuse was the only way to protect the peace. But I realize now that dropping that heavy, rusted armor did not transform me into the villain of the story. Sometimes, taking aim and pulling the trigger to utterly destroy a poisonous lie is not an act of cruelty. It is the absolute kindest, most necessary act of salvation a warrior can ever perform for herself. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.